So next up in my aesthetics and embodiment reading list, I took on this little book called On Beauty and Being Just by Elaine Scarry. Elaine Scarry is the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics at Harvard University. And she wrote probably her best known for its aesthetics content book, The Body in Pain, in '85. And she came to kind of somewhat more notorious attention when the TWA flight went down. And I don't know if it was ever actually resolved, but she's the one who published the big editorial in the Post or the Times or something about how she was under the understanding that it was a government conspiracy and the plane was shot down through government radio wave interference. So she's someone with a very interesting kind of perspective on the world, to say the very least, and is an endowed chair in aesthetics at kind of one of the bastions of aesthetic thinking and kind of philosophy in general. So a little bit of a preamble to this is, I think, useful. One of the contexts into which this text is going is a general decline in the concern for the aesthetics broadly in the academy in terms of philosophy. Now, Johnson addresses this in his book Meaning in the Body, which I addressed last time, and Scarry addresses it too in a very different way. She has no desire whatsoever to crumble, challenge, attack, or defeat the kind of standard Western assumption of the mind-body problem, and isn't really interested in addressing embodiment, as far as I could tell, at all in any substantially different way. She is attempting to reclaim an old school appreciation of aesthetics. So old school, it's almost as if one reviewer of the book said she doesn't know that the 20th century happened. I mean, she really is writing in a way that almost seems naive in terms of the kinds of things that have happened. It's not as if I don't think that she could handle them, she just chooses not to address a lot of the critique that comes up with aesthetics, or came up with aesthetics in the 1900s. And certainly hardly anything that came up past 2000. What she's doing in here in the book is tying the appreciation to beauty with being just. And I want to address this book in kind of two pieces. One is what she seems to be saying, and two, kind of my review and kind of critique on her commentary. I want to split those up this time. I, Elaine Scarry, say that the beautiful is important because our perception of the beautiful can be incorrect. What's that? Well, there are sometimes things that you think are beautiful and then you later realize are not, and some things you think are not beautiful and you later realize they are. In the cases where you suddenly realize something that you have had an experience with is beautiful and you didn't realize it was, there's this captivating moment, that's this transfixing moment when you realize that you were wrong, that your perception of beauty in the object, the poem or the sculpture or the person, or even, she says, the math equation, is in fact beautiful and you didn't realize it, and boom, there's this moment where you brush up against the ultimate, kind of the noumenal realms of other ultimateness, and some things happen in those moments. In the first section, she says, she just kind of describes this process by which the evaluation and the the means by which one can be wrong of their aesthetic evaluation takes place. And in the second half of the book, she says, when you realize you're wrong and you brush up against the beautiful and it captures you, you become decentered. She says on page 111, at the moment we see something beautiful, we undergo a radical decentering. Beauty requires us to, quote, give up our imaginary position as the center. A transformation then takes place at the very roots of our sensibility, in our immediate reception of sense impressions and psychological impressions. It's the single best or most obvious thing in our surroundings, which is an occasion for unselfing, that's another way she says decentering, is to encounter what is popularly called beauty. That's 113. And the thrust of the on beauty and being wrong part is that she says there are things that you observe kind of sensorially that you do not think are beautiful or you do not appreciate, and then you come to understand, in fact, are beautiful. And you know, this is a reasonable thing to consider, that there's an album that you buy, to the degree that people buy albums anymore, for a particular song, and you listen to the album, but really you're listening for the certain track on it. And then years later, you start to really come to an appreciation for another track. And you say, man, how come I never realized what a great song this was? Or some equivalent thereof. So the concept there is fine. And she says that beauty, because it has this element of, you know, the possibility of being wrong about it. That is, you thought that the thing that was beautiful was on that kind of album, only this track, but it turns out there was beauty in the other track that you didn't perceive before. She categorizes that as being wrong about an aesthetic judgment, and then when you come to the rightness about it, it kind of strikes you, and you cannot help but kind of succumb to the awareness that you were wrong about your aesthetic judgment. It is not a poem or a painting or a palm tree or a person that is true, but rather that it ignites the desire for truth by giving us, with an electric brightness shared by almost no other uninvited, freely arriving perceptual event, the experience of conviction and the experience of, as well, error. This liability to error, contestation, and plurality, for which beauty over the centuries has so often been belittled, has sometimes been cited as evidence in its falsehood and distance from truth, when it is instead the case that our very aspiration for truth is its legacy. It creates, that is beauty, without itself fulfilling the aspiration for enduring certitude. It comes to us with no work of our own, and then leaves us prepared to undergo a giant labor. She's arguing that in meeting the beautiful, the aesthetically pleasing, we brush up against something that captivates us, that transforms us. And because we're aware that beauty is a category which is liable to error, contestation, and plurality, and yet in spite of all of its ambiguity, we still are sometimes transfixed by the beautiful. By encountering the beautiful in this way, we end up ourselves being transformed and prepared to, as she say, undergo giant labors. She gives no mechanism by which encountering this beauty, which somehow transforms us and leaves us ready to do the next great thing, happens. But she affirms that, in fact, it is the case that this does take place. She says in the section on page 62, the kind of thesis, I think, of the second half. It is the argument of this chapter that beauty, far from contributing to social injustice, actually assists us in the work of addressing injustice, not only by requiring of us constant perceptual acuity, high dives of seeing, hearing, and touching, but the more direct forms of instruction sketched in the next parts of the chapter. by realizing that we can sometimes be wrong about aesthetic perception, as she addressed in the first half, we come to realize we need to practice having better perceptual acuity, being able to take in the world and see really what's going on. And she says if we get good at that, training ourselves with arts and literature and kind of beauty, then in fact when we are up against a societal ugliness, injustice, we will see it more clearly and then presumably change it, although she doesn't address that. So her argument for how it is that perceiving or understanding or coming to understand that something is beautiful leads to social justice is kind of pushed onto page 80. And she says, when we see something that is perceived as beautiful and it kind of transfixes us, we become bound up with it and an urge to protect it or act on its behalf in a way that appears to be tied up with the perception of its lifelikeness. Something about it makes us feel like we're more alive, and so we attribute to it lifelikeness and therefore want to protect it. That's the argument there. And she also points out here that when we, on 81, kind of get captivated by it, our attention is thrown kind of to the other, outward beyond ourselves. And she says the practice of with perceptual acuity, perceiving the beautiful, becoming transfixed with it, and then only be concerned with it so that you're no longer concerned with yourself, develops a habit of other regard, which is necessary for social justice. One of the things she does that's interesting is kind of make an argument for the category of beauty being notably different than other kind of similar, all-important, and I would write here, kind of Western Greek categories. And she says that one of the interesting characteristics of it is that someone who pursues goodness, or is interested in studying or learning about goodness, presumably does so in hopes of making oneself good. If you're pursuing truth, you hope that you become wise. If you pursue justice, that you one day hope that to be able to count yourself among the just. There is, in other words, a continuity between the thing being pursued and the pursuer's own attributes. Although in each case there has been an enhancement of the self, the undertaking and the outcome are in a very deep sense, unself-interested, since in each case the benefits to others are folded into the nature of my being good or bearing knowledge or acting justly. In this sense, it may have been misleading to phrase the question in terms of a person's hope for himself. It's more accurate to say that one cannot further the aims of justice without placing oneself in the company of the just. However you phrase this, though, beauty is something utterly different. It does not appear to be the case that one who pursues beauty becomes beautiful, or even intends to. It may even be accurate to suppose that most people who pursue beauty have no interest in becoming beautiful themselves. It would be hard to make the same description of someone pursuing the other objects of aspiration. Could one pursue truth if one had no interest in becoming knowledgeable? This would in fact seem like quite a feat. How exactly would one go about doing that? Where would there be a way to approach goodness while keeping oneself free of the good? Again, a path for doing so does not immediately suggest itself, and the same difficulties await us if we come up for ways of furthering the ideas of justice while remaining ourselves outside of the reach of the just. And so she says the reason that beauty occupies this kind of other category is because of this discontinuous break, that when we apprehend beauty, kind of it apprehends us and it thrusts us out beyond the normal self kind of other dichotomy into a kind of a blown out, distributed sense of awareness. And that when we do that, we go beyond the normal categories, and in fact going beyond the normal, she says, is in fact where we touch the ultimate, the kind of the other noumenal sphere, and therefore develop this taste of the sacred. So that's her position, and that's her reasoning for it, and I think it's very interesting and horrifically done. This is a weird little book. For someone who presumably is kind of incredibly intelligent and capable and an academic, the arguments are bizarrely disparate. I cannot say I would recommend you read this book unless you're looking for kind of the academic equivalent of a slight acid trip. You read little bits and pieces of it and it seems really beautiful, and then you get to the next part and you have no idea how you got to where you are from where you were. So her argument, she tries to lay it out stepwise, but it's very, very difficult to track in between sections, let alone between the halves of the book. So I've kind of summarized her argument and tried to do it in such a way that the book itself is clear, but it's worth reading a couple pages at a time because she's a very talented writer. The prose is beautiful, but it's not good in the sense that not just that it's not like academically well done, but it's also really hard to follow. So like at the micro level, the prose is great and fun, and there's some really interesting sentences and paragraphs. As a text, though, as a monograph, the flow of the whole thing is bizarrely disconnected from itself even. So I would love to have a conversation with Elaine Scarry and ask her if she did that on purpose, because it's possible, given her thesis, that the book is just supposed to be a collection of beautiful pieces of text. And it's supposed to make me feel like I encountered the ultimate via her beautiful prose, and she has done something to help me feel like I need to work towards justice for the world. But that would be giving her an awful lot of credit, when I think it's just quite possible it's a weird little book written in a weird little way by someone who is quite possibly weird and little herself. Not bad, just bizarre and full of discontinuities. Good thoughts, funny container. Elaine Scarry's On Beauty and Being Just, 1999, Princeton University Press.